Hey everyone, how's it going? So I'm here for the second installment in my read-through of the New Testament, and I've come now to the Gospel of Mark, the second of the four Gospels as it's ordered in the New Testament, but probably, as I understand it, the first that was actually written historically. And being the earliest Gospel, I think you can kind of tell that from its length and how kind of flimsy it is. It does feel kind of skeletal, almost like an outline, almost like the author of it was just kind of taking down notes from, stories you heard around a fire or something like that, or a recitation of an oral tradition that he just wanted to record in as literal a way as possible, because I think that there's also a lot less literary quality to Mark than there was to Matthew, and than I can remember from Luke and John, certainly. So Mark, when I've read it in the past, I've always found to be a little bit underwhelming in relation to the other Gospels, a little bit flimsy, and so reading it tends to be kind of dull, less interesting. And that was sort of my experience this time around, but I did find a couple of things that were of interest, I think, and so I will go through them as I do in these videos. I just mark up spots that I find interesting in the various books of the Bible and just go through what I found interesting, why I found it interesting, why I found it weird, or why I found it contradictory, or why it puzzles me, and just sort of leave it open like that, leave it open-ended and ask you to offer your commentary, maybe offer your answers to my questions, or your own commentary, and so on and so forth. But I will say, definitely, I think this is the gospel with the least literary value. Like, if you were to read it completely divorced from the fact that it's a religious text, I think you wouldn't come away thinking that this was, a great pinnacle of world literature. Even in the King James Version, which is definitely a pinnacle of translation and a pinnacle in the English language, the Gospel of Mark, just as a gospel, isn't great. One thing I definitely noticed in this, again, going back to how it feels a little bit flimsy, a little bit skeletal, there are a lot of famous stories that we associate with Jesus' life that are not here. For example, there is no nativity scene. As far as I can tell or remember, there's not even really any reference to Jesus being born of a virgin. There is no Sermon on the Mount, which I had forgotten, actually, from the last time I read Mark. I totally forgot that there is no Sermon on the Mount in Mark, which is just crazy. That's like one of the most integral parts of how we think of Jesus's life, right? It's like, what I've heard people say is that, if nothing of the Bible but the Sermon on the Mount survived somehow, then Christianity could live on. And so for Mark to not even have Sermon on the Mount is just kind of boggling to me. The temptation narrative, where Jesus goes out into the wilderness and is tempted for 40 days and 40 nights lasts for like a sentence or two, whereas in Matthew it was a whole thing. It wasn't a whole chapter, I don't think, but it was several paragraphs. Now, what I did find to be very interesting is I think that there are little fragments you find scattered throughout Mark of little nuggets of wisdom that you find that are that would become the Sermon on the Mount, that would be cobbled together into the Sermon on the Mount and perhaps elaborated by later writers into the Sermon on the Mount. And I found coming across those little fragments to be very interesting. One thing that I thought was very interesting was that in the scene in the very first chapter, when Jesus is baptized by John the Baptist, John doesn't recognize him. In the Gospel of Matthew, and from what I can remember of the other Gospels, John always recognizes Jesus when Jesus approaches him and asks to be baptized. And he knows who Jesus is and says, "Why should I baptize you? You should be the one who baptizes me." That's kind of a famous moment in the life of Jesus. And that doesn't happen in this one. John doesn't recognize him, which suggests to me that Jesus was a bit more of a marginal figure than perhaps the later gospel writers like Matthew and Luke wanted us to think he was, that he wasn't, John didn't formally know of him because he was more obscure than the other gospel writers wanted him to seem. I did notice in the Gospel of Mark much less of a us versus them mentality in regards to the Jewish authorities. That was much less vilifying of, the Sadducees and the Pharisees and others. You have some more positive representation of Jewish authorities, and I'm guessing that that has to do again with the historical period that Mark was written in versus when Matthew was written in. Matthew, I'm guessing, was written when there had developed some animosity between the Jews and the Christians, and so Matthew wanted to portray the Jewish authorities very negatively, whereas Mark was perhaps written in a time when relations between the Christians and the Jews were more peaceful, and so he was okay with portraying them more positively. And in fact, it seems like Jesus says the opposite of something that he says in the Gospel of Matthew. What he says in chapter 9, verse 40 is, "For he that is not against us is on our part." So those who aren't, he's saying that those who aren't against him are with him. So if someone isn't explicitly against him, then he is for him. And in the Gospel of Matthew, he said the exact opposite, which is that those who aren't for us are against us. And I thought that that was a super interesting direct contradiction between these two Gospels. And I thought it was super interesting that there seemed to be a couple of points where the text suggests that Jesus' power to work miracles only works in the presence of believers. And I didn't get that sense in Matthew that there had to be believers present in order for Jesus' miracle working to occur. And so that suggests that Jesus' powers, so to speak, were more limited in Mark's story, in the earlier stories, than they were in the later stories. It seems like Matthew and the other gospel writers gradually turned Jesus into more of a god. So anyway, that's really all I had to say about Mark, so I would love to hear your guys' thoughts about Mark, what you think in response to what I've said, such as it is. But next I will be moving on to the Gospel of Luke, so I look forward to that, and I'll talk to you all later. Bye.